Live. Okay, I am going to talk to you today about King George V again. I am picking up where I left off, and I just wanted to share with you a picture of George V during World War I, so you can take a look at that. Here is some other pictures here. This is another of George V during World War I. As you can see, he and Queen Mary are inspecting German folklore airplanes in this picture. But, yeah, just so you can see a few pictures of what he looked like. Real quickly, I wanted to share with you a whole host of books I have been reading, and they are very fascinating reads. I have read this one, and it is a long book, but I found it a wonderful, fascinating read and insight into Edward VII and his long wait for the reign. He stayed married to Princess Alexandra, even though he had other dalliances, as we know. But when he finally did become the king, it was really interesting. So I have another book here on, I'm just going to X out of that for a bit, on this, The Matriarch by Anne Edwards. And this is such, this was one of my favorite books to read. I found this on thriftbook.com. So any book that you might want to read on Queen Mary, I'm sure is very good. But this one is The Matriarch by Anne Edwards, and it gave me such a wonderful insight into Queen Mary. Again, part of the House of Windsor's read. The next one that I found was really, really good, and it is still out there. You might be able to find this on Amazon. This was written by Hugo Vickers, and I have recently seen Kinsey Schofield talk about this book, Alice, Princess Andrew of Greece. She had this amazing and remarkable life, and look at that picture of her. She really was very beautiful. But to hear her story about being married to Andrew, who was a military man, and Prince in Greece, they had a good love story up until I believe, their second exile, and it really threw Alice for a loop as to what to do. But when you see everything that she has done and how dedicated she was to serving the people of Greece, there she left England, a very comfortable monarchy at the time, went to Greece to serve the people of Greece, and it was a good life until they were in exile, until they started facing some upheaval. And it's this book by Hugo Vickers. It's a wonderful book. So, and then of course you find a little about the sisters of Prince Philip, and then you find out about Prince Philip. And this is a book by Robert Jepson, and this is a really, really good book about Prince Philip, and I really enjoyed it. And I tell you, I was so impressed by Prince Philip while he was alive, the more I got to know him. But after reading this book, I really thoroughly enjoyed reading these books. Look for them on Amazon, or if they're really vintage, you might be able to see if somebody's willing to sell these books on thriftbook.com. This one is really good. So I'd love to, in the future, if I can, read about those books to people if they're interested, because it's such a fascinating life to read about these monarchs. I am so over hearing about Harry and Meghan. I wish them well in a decent way, but when you look and read into these people, the Mountbattens and the Windsors, and nobody's perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and get started reading my next segment. which is entitled Fisher Overboard. So here, okay, if you can read that. So, Fisher Overboard. The king, this has several different topics in this chapter 6, so I'm breaking it down a little at a time. People have very, very busy lives, and they may not want to listen to this section, but there are some very fascinating sections and tidbits that you get out of reading this. So, the king, as a conventional strategist on land, as in sea, he wrote in December 1915, I consider that this war will be lost or won in the main theaters of the war. I mean in France, in Russia, and in Italy. And the British Empire must make haste and concentrate all their strength and all of our strength and all of our energy to produce as strong an army as possible to take the offensive in France in the spring, and the Allies must deliver their attacks simultaneously, and by then the Central Powers, I am sure, will not be able to stand the strain. It was a view shared almost unanimously by the British and the French General Staff. With the repulse of the German advance on Paris in the autumn of 1914, the war on the Western Front had frozen into stalemate. Two entrenched armies faced each other along a line that stretched from the English Channel to the Alps. Each side, in turn, tried to break the deadlock by launching a succession of massive attacks against the enemy's front. Assaults which did no more than gain a strip of ravaged battlefield at an almost endurable price. From time to time, the balance of advantage would be tilted by a new tactical weapon, such as poison gas or the tank. Yet throughout 4 long years of attrition, neither Germany nor the Allies believed that the war could be won elsewhere. The king put no faith in those men of inventive mind who, like Churchill, sought an alternative strategy. As early in the war as December 1914, he regretted that troops were being deployed against German colonies in the comparatively unimportant theater of East Africa. The subsequent failure of others sideshows strengthened the king's prejudice. After the humiliating reversals of Gallipoli and Mesopotamia, he treated his ministers not to embark on the Salonika campaign, which is little likely to be attended with more success than the unfortunate enterprises. Although wholly committed to a Western Front strategy, the king sometimes doubted the ability of the generals entrusted with its operation. Foremost of them, as Field Marshal John J. French, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in France from August 1914 until his unwilling retirement 16 months later. French, like so many senior generals of his day, was a cavalryman. This was not necessarily a handicap, even when fighting a campaign that depended almost entirely on infantry and artillery. But he also lacked that nimbleness of mind and phlegmatic temperament which sustained great commanders throughout the hazards of battle. Nearly 63 years of age on the outbreak of war, he was obstinate, obstructive, and choleric. Disloyal to Kitchener, suspicious of his allies, and jealous of his subordinates. During the first operations of the war, A sullen determination to act independently of the French armies put the whole Allied front in danger. And when the German advance on Paris faltered, his lack of determination lost the British expeditionary force its chance of mauling a retreating enemy. In September 1915, his conduct of the unsuccessful Battle of Loos convinced both king and prime minister that he must be replaced. He not only withheld vital reserves from his senior army commander, Douglas Haig, but later he doctored his dispatch on the battle to make it seem as if the blame lay elsewhere. In his mistrust of French, the king did not, of course, possess any of that professional knowledge and experience which he could bring to bear on naval matters, but he maintained a close friendship and correspondence with one of the ablest generals of the day, none other than Douglas Haig, to whom he gave his complete trust and support. Haig's intimacy with the king owed much to family connections. His sister Mary, a rich whiskey distiller, was a friend of the king, Edward VII, who appointed Haig to be an aide-de-camp. By 1904, after making his reputation as an exceptionally competent staff officer in the South African War, he found himself at 43 Inspector General of Cavalry in India with the rank of Major General. On home leave in the following year, Haig was invited to spend Ascot Week at Windsor. It was here that the future King George V, the Prince of Wales, unwittingly drew him even closer into the royal circle. The prince had asked Haig to play golf on the private course of the castle, but he was prevented from keeping the appointment. So a foursome was arranged, Haig and Miss Dorothy Vivian, a maid of honor to Queen Alexandra, against the Duke of Devonshire and another member of the house party. As the Duke kept finding himself in a bunker, Haig and his partner found plenty of time to talk. 2 days later, the shy soldier, with the reputation of a misogynist, proposed to Miss Vivian and was accepted. Crown notoriously averse to losing members of their entourage through marriage. Queen Alexandra, however, always moved by affairs of the heart. She encouraged the match, and knowing that by Edwardian standards, Haig was a poor man, he held no shares in the family whiskey business and had been left only £500 by his father. She insisted that the marriage ceremony and wedding breakfast should take place at Buckingham Palace. Haig's friendship with the royal family continued into the new reign. A week after the outbreak of war, the king asked for his opinion of Field Marshal French. "In my heart," Haig wrote in his diary, "I know that French is quite unfit for this great command at a time of crisis in our nation's history. But I thought it sufficient to tell the king that I had doubts about the selection. French's inept performance as commander-in-chief of the Western Front soon provoked both the king and Haig to speak more frankly to each other." The king, however, was embarrassed at asking Haig to send him private reports on a senior officer, just the sort of underhanded conduct that he had condemned in Admiral Fisher. He confessed to Kirchner what he had done, adding that a boy who told tales about the school would be called a sneak. The Secretary for War, who shared his sovereign's misgivings about French, replied that they were no longer schoolboys. Haig, too, he felt uneasy at conspiring behind the back of both his commander-in-chief and friend who had done much to further the young man's career. But he overcame his scruples. After entertaining the king at his headquarters in France, he wrote an account of their talk. It concluded, French's handling of the reserves in the last battle, his obstinacy and his conceit showed his incapacity, and it seemed to me to be impossible for anyone to prevent him from doing the same things. I therefore thought strongly that, for the sake of the empire, French ought to be removed. Other generals who the king consulted during the tour of the British line in October 1915 echoed Haig's judgment and convinced him the French must go. A few days later, while continuing his inspection of troops, the king suffered that crashing fall from a horse, which was to affect his health for the rest of his life. Okay, so you can see here he's got a cane. Yeah, you could see looks to me like that's a cane of some sort. So. Although in severe pain, he pressed the prime minister from his sickbed to replace French. And when the field marshal appeared reluctant to go even on generous terms, a peerage, the promise of a monetary grant at the end of the war, and immediate command of the home forces. The king insisted that Asquith should act without delay. On the 4th of December, 1915, French was at last prized from his command of the British armies on the Western Front. It was a notable victory for the king, who did not readily forgive the newly created Lord French his obstinacy. By contrast, French's successor as commander-in-chief received the warmest of royal welcomes. The king wrote to Haig on December the 17th, 1915. Remember that it will always be a pleasure to me to help you in any way I can to carry out your heavy task and important responsibilities. I hope that you will from time to time write to me quite freely and tell me how matters are progressing. Naturally, I shall consider your letters in the strictest confidence. Throughout the next 3 years, often to the annoyance of his ministers, the king kept faith with his friend. Okay, and there's that topic. I am going to go and read the next section, which is entitled Haig versus French. For 3 weeks, no one has thought of the enemy, Churchill told his wife on the day French agreed to resign his command. Asquith must bear much of the blame for so scandalous a delay in removing the field marshal. It was one example of his increasing failure as a war leader. That precise, reflective mind, which had served him well enough in the tactics of parliamentary maneuver, was ill-suited to meet the crisis of Armageddon. Nor had the inclusion of certain conservative statesmen in the reconstructed government of May 1915 proved reassuring. Kirchner gave Escher a chilling account of a cabinet discussion on the conscription. After a long debate, At 2:30, the Prime Minister said to the cabinet, "Please remember that in an hour's time I have to tell the House of Commons what the cabinet have decided." There was a silence for a minute or two, and then AJB said, "You had better tell them that the cabinet has decided it is quite incapable of conducting the business of the country and of carrying on the war." No one having made any observation upon this, the Prime Minister asked, "And I am to say that to the House of Commons?" Upon the AJB observed, "Well, if you do, you will at any rate be telling them the truth." The cabinet broke up without a decision. During Asquith's occasional absence from Number 10, the conduct of business was even more undisciplined. Here from Haig's diary is a vignette of a cabinet meeting presided over by Lord Crewe. Everyone seemed desirous to speak at the same moment. One would say, "Please, please allow me to finish what I am saying." Another would interrupt, and a third would shout from the far end of the table that he meant to have his say on the matter. Poor Lord Crewe feebly rapped the table and said, "Order, please." In a disconsolate way, this sort of thing really makes one tremble for the Empire. That master of invective, General Sir Henry Wilson, called the coalition cabinet a miserable pack of hesitations and hiccos. His friend Leo Amory, the Tory MP, described it as 22 gabblers round a table with an old procrastinator in the chair. As if a dilatory prime minister were not alarming enough, there was an element of self-indulgence in Asquith which further eroded confidence. He seemed to have as much leisure in war as he had enjoyed in peace. No day was complete without a budget of indiscretion written to Miss Stanley and the cabinet table itself, though his son Raymond did not receive a single line from him throughout 10 months at the front. An hour or two of reading each evening in the library of the Athenaeum Club, a cozy dinner party followed by several rubbers of bridge, and at the end of each exhausting week, there would be 2 or 3 recuperative days in the country. It was a regime in sharp contrast to his sovereign. Asquith, he was also said to be addicted to the drink. Certainly he did not volunteer to share the king's pledge of abstinence, and there were occasions in the Commons, as the lying in state of Edward VII, when he appeared to have dined well. The historian should treat such rumors with reserve. The Prime Minister could be a wiser man fuddled than many of his contemporaries sober. Haig wrote of a visit by Asquith to France. The Prime Minister seemed to like our old brandy. He had a couple of glasses, a big sherry glass, before I left the table at 9:30, and apparently he had several more before I saw him again. By that time his legs were unsteady, but his head was quite clear, and he was able to read a map and discuss the situation with me. Such fortitude was magnificent, but it did not win the war. Throughout Asquith's premiership, the country endured an almost unbroken succession of reverses and humiliations. Haig seceded French, but casualties on the Western Front continued to mount by the hundreds of thousands, and still the enemy lines held firm. Among the dead were John Bigg, Stanfordham's only son, and Raymond Asquith. There was a rebellion in Ireland. treachery in the Balkans, disease and defeat in Mesopotamia. German U-boats took their toll of Allied shipping so that food became scarce and unpalatable. German aircraft bombed London and other cities, affecting both industrial and production and morale. The Battle of Jutland, it revealed faults in Britain's naval construction, signaling and gunnery, although the king could at last rejoice that his second son, serving in HMS Collingwood, had survived the baptism by fire. These events caused dismay, yet nothing to arrest the falsified drift of the government. It was the death of Kirchner, drowned at sea in June in 1916 while on his way to put new heart into Russia. That set in the train, Asquith's downfall was 6 months later. The nation mourned a leader of reassuring stature, and the king broke with protocol by attending a memorial service to a subject. Actually, just a pause. The king broke with protocol just to attend Kirchner's memorial service. Well, Queen Elizabeth broke with protocol when she attended Winston Churchill's memorial service. The nation mourned a leader of reassuring stature, and the king broke with protocol by attending a memorial service to a subject. Lloyd George was also stirred by the death of his cabinet colleague. He was to have sailed with Kirchner to Russia, but he remained behind to deal with the Easter Rebellion in Ireland. At the very height of his confidence, no man had less wished to share Kirchner's noble epitaph. Coffined in a man of war, he passed to the great beyond. The place for Lloyd George was at the heart of events, and neither sorrow nor decorum deterred him from laying siege to the vacant War Office. Until the matter was settled, Asquith acted as Secretary of State for War. He told Stamfordham, "All this canvassing and wire pulling about the succession, while poor Kay's body is still tossing about in the North Sea, seems to me to be in the highest degree of indecent." Springing from patriotism and ambition alike, Lloyd George's claim could scarcely be denied. As Minister of Munitions for the past year, he had infused the industry with energy and imagination, appealing to the nation with a Celtic eloquence that made toil a duty and sacrifice a joy. Yet there was considerable opposition to his appointment. The king, while admiring the dynamo, mistrusted the demagogue. Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the Cabinet of War Committee, wrote after an audience at the palace on the 10th of June. The king went into the most violent diatribe against Lloyd George, as I thought he would. I kept trying to stand up for Lloyd George and reminded the king of all he had done and how useful he is on the War Committee. But the king would hardly listen. The king's own choice would have been the decent and reliable Austen Chamberlain, the Secretary of State for India and Neville Chamberlain's half-brother. Failing that, he wanted Asquith with him to continue indefinitely as both Prime Minister and Secretary of State for War, with the malleable Lord Derby as his deputy. At such a time of political stress, however, the king's preferences carried little weight. Whether or not Lloyd George won the coveted post turned not on royal disfavor, but on the support of or enmity of the cabinet colleagues. Most of the conservatives in the coalition were against him, impressed by almost unanimous opposition to Lloyd George from the War Office staff. Even the support of his fellow liberals was not always what it seemed. Edwin Montagu, who in the previous year had married the Prime Minister's confidant, Venetia Stanley, wrote to Asquith, "It would also be clearly advantageous to have LG at the War Office during the announcement of heavy casualties and a possible unfruitful offensive." The Prime Minister tried to solve the impasse by dangling the War Office before Bonar Law, but the Conservative leader had already made common cause with Lloyd George and declined to move from the Colonial Office. That set the seal on Lloyd George's appointment. Although he appeared to lose a last tussle about the division of powers between a civilian Secretary of State and a professional military staff, it was a concession he could afford to make. Few doubted he would remain at the War Office only long enough to seize the highest place of all. On the day his new post was announced, Margot Asquith wrote in her diary, "We are out. It can only be a question of time now when we shall have to leave Downing Street." Lloyd George, he took exactly 5 months to displace Asquith as Prime Minister. 5 frustrating months during which not even an imaginative Secretary of War could arrest Britain's declining fortunes. At the very outset, he inherited ministerial responsibility for the disastrous Battle of Somme, which on the first day alone claimed 57,000 British casualties. He tried to wean the generals from their obsessive strategy, what he called unintelligent hammering against the impenetrable barrier. But the Chief of Imperial General Staff, Sir William Robertson, resisted every attempt by the War Minister to influence military operations. Hankey warned Lloyd George that he could not hope to prevail against the most conservative and powerful trade unions in the world. Thwarted by such consecrated obstructions, he could achieve no more than the appointment of Sir Eric Geddes, an experienced railway manager, to reorganize the transport system in France. Nor could he rouse the colleagues to lend him their support. The fate of the nation depended upon the incoherent cabinet of 20 that deliberated without agenda, secretary, or minutes. Only a small and resolute body could win that war, and this Lloyd George was determined to create. The king noted in his diary on 4 December 1916, "The Prime Minister came and told me about the cabinet crisis, started by Lloyd George, who wants to run the War Committee. The government will have to be reconstructed. I told the Prime Minister that I had the fullest confidence in him. It was the climax to weeks of feverish talks between members of the coalition, a series of conclaves and cabals inspired by Sir Max Aitken, Conservative MP, and a newspaper owner. Soon to be created Lord Beaverbrook, Lloyd George's ultimatum to Asquith demanded the creation of a small war committee with executive powers. It also implied, without naming either antagonist, that the Prime Minister would be merely its titular head. Asquith was to remain at number 10, but Lloyd George was to rule the roost. The Prime Minister replied the same day. He accepted the need for an authoritative war committee, but he insisted that the Prime Minister must be its chairman. At the same time, he suggested that there should be a vice chairman, a conciliatory hint that he might be prepared to leave it day-to-day decisions to Lloyd George. Pleased with his draftsmanship, Asquith departed for a quiet weekend by the sea. Less than 24 hours later, he was back in London, fighting for his ministerial life. Bonar-Law had been persuaded to support Lloyd George's demands. Rather than risk their resignations and the collapse of his coalition, Asquith agreed to a war committee with Lloyd George as chairman. To save his face, it was to be announced that the Prime Minister should have a supreme and effective control over war policy, as well as the right to attend meetings of the War Committee. The government would be reconstructed accordingly. The crisis, it seemed, was over. On the following morning, however, the Prime Minister changed his mind. A leading article in the Times described the compromise as a humiliating surrender imposed upon an ineffective war leader. Believing it could have been inspired only by Lloyd George, the Prime Minister insisted that their compact should be cancelled. He wrote to Lloyd George, "Unless the impression is at once corrected that I am being relegated to the position of an irresponsible spectator of the war, I cannot possibly go on." And a second later to Lloyd George that day, Asquith's attitude stiffened further. He rejected Lloyd George's demand that Carson should replace Balfour as the First Lord of the Admiralty. There could be but one reply to the Prime Minister's intransigence. As all delay is fatal in war, Lloyd George wrote, "I place my office without further parley at your disposal." His letter ended on a note of barely described menace. "As I am fully conscious of the importance of preserving national unity, I propose to give your government complete support in the vigorous prosecution of the war. But unity without action is nothing but futile carnage, and I cannot be responsible for that. Vigor and vision are the supreme need at this hour." The king was infuriated by the conduct of Lloyd George. "He's a blackmailer who is better to tackle and have done with." But Asquith was in no position to survive Lloyd George's resignation. Learning in the course of the day that almost every leading conservative had also deserted him, he too resigned that evening. The king much regretted the loss of his prime minister. "I feel that it will cause a panic in the city and in America and do harm to the Allies. It is a great blow to me, and will, I fear, buck up the Germans." Following the constitutional custom, the king then sent for the leader of the next largest party of the Commons, Bonar-Law, and asked him to form a government. It was an acrid encounter. The king had not forgotten Law's non-treasonable sentiments and disrespectful homily during the Home Rule controversy. 4 years later, the two men argued with a rancor that permeates even Stanfordham's dispassionate record. They clashed on the relative merits of Asquith and Lloyd George. The king denied that Asquith has mismanaged the war. On the relations between the ministers and the military, the king said that politicians should leave the conduct of the war to experts. On Law's request for the promise of a dissolution of Parliament as a condition of undertaking to form a government, the king, anxious to avoid an unsettling general election in wartime, was constitutionally correct in refusing such a pledge to to a supplicant who had not yet become prime minister. Law nevertheless said that he would try to form a government. His hope of success hinged on whether he could persuade the fallen prime minister to join his administration in a subordinate office. But when he called at Downing Street after his audience with the king, he was rebuffed. Asquith did, however, agree to attend a conference at the palace summoned by the king the following day. It was attended by Asquith, Lloyd George, Bonar Law, Balfour, and Arthur Henderson, who represented the Labour Party. Each participant in return pledged with Asquith to serve under the law of patriotic grounds and so maintain an appearance of national unity. Asquith refused. In a long apologia tinged with bitterness, he observed that throughout his alleged mismanagement of the war, he could not recall any issue on which a decision had been reached without the concurrence of Lloyd George. That he'd been subjected to vindictive and merciless attacks by the press, that he was grateful to His Majesty for the trust placed upon him, but that he had awoken that morning thankful to feel that he was now a free man. At that point, the king, with his habitual common sense, he reminded the politicians that they had discussed the matter fully, but had not yet come to a decision. The meeting thereupon agreed with Asquith should further consider whether or not he was prepared to serve under law, and that if he still felt unable to do so, Lloyd George, rather than Bonar Law, should try to form a government. The conference broke at 4:30. Asquith immediately consulted his Liberal colleagues. Then, fortified by their almost unanimous approval, he delivered his final answer to Law. Rather than join any administration of which he was not the head, he would lead a sober, responsible opposition, steadily supporting the government in the conduct of war. Lloyd George now remained the sole contender for the premiership. At 7:30, he was entrusted by the king with the formation of a new ministry. 24 hours later, his cabinet was complete. He kissed the hands as prime minister on Lloyd George's death in 1945. It fell to the prime minister of the day, Winston Churchill, to pronounce the traditional eulogy in the House of Commons. He was heard in an approving silence until he touched on the events of December 1916. Churchill. Presently, Lloyd George seized the main power in the state and the headship of the government. Honorary members, seized? Churchill, seized. I think it was Carlyle who said of Oliver Cromwell, he coveted the place. Perhaps the place was his. Okay, and that ends this episode. We will go on and cover the next topics, which is Lloyd George versus Asquith as prime minister. And that is a different topic and a different episode. So I'll take a break and I'll be back. So again, if you want to read these books, go look for them. KingGeorge, written by Kenneth Rose. Go look for them at the library. Look for them at thriftbook.com and you'll find this. I have found so many books off of thriftbook.com. I am looking forward to reading this book to you one day. And this one is QueenMary. her story is such a fascinating story. And if you want to look into a really good channel that talks about King George, just want to see if I can find him in here. There's a channel out here called The People's Profile, and in it talks about it's got Clementine, Churchill, it's got all the King Georges, King George V, King George VI, a lot of key figures, Edward IV, Henry VIII, presidents, Wilhelm II, the last emperor of Germany. He does a really good compilation of videos that discuss it, and he does a really good overview of the history of the king of those times. I can't quite find it here, but this is the channel, so check it out and look for King George V, because he's got a really good thing. Here it is.
If you know TV, you have YouTube TV. Join
12 years of age, his father decided that he and Albert would benefit from joining the British Navy and exploring the world. They were enrolled in the Royal Navy in 1877, and in 1879, after some initial seafaring training, the two young princes...
It's an hour and 10 minutes long.
A war on Germany in response to developments across the continent.
It's a really good.
He referred to these events in his diary later that day as a, quote, terrible
I like this
catastrophe.
channel, The People's Profile. They have,
like many others, he was naively of the view that the First World War would be a quick affair.
Better than I
Instead,
could ever do.
it dragged on
just
for over 4 years of bloody trench warfare in northern France and elsewhere.
To how people
the monarchy was somewhat compromised by the outbreak of the war owing to the close relations which existed between Europe's major royal families by the early 20th century. Nearly all of the royal houses were intermarried, and George, Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, and Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, were all first cousins. Moreover, the king's paternal grandfather, Queen Victoria,